Hello, welcome. Today I'm going to start the tutorial on Philosophical Foundation, a critical analysis of basic beliefs by Dr. Surrendra Gangadean, who was my mentor for the past almost 30 years. This book I think it's the best book ever, and I want to help you read it and understand it. So I'm just going to pretend like you're my student and we're in the classroom and we're going to read the book together and I'm going to comment on it. And the first thing we need to think about, though, is how do we approach a book? How do you approach a book? So what I do when I get a new book is I look at the title and look at the subtitle and think about, all right, what's this book about? So this is Philosophical Foundation. That's the main title. It's a philosophy book and it's about foundational beliefs. A critical analysis of basic beliefs. Critical analysis. So we're going to be critically examining things, which means we are going to have to think hard about basic beliefs. So basic beliefs are foundational beliefs. Everybody has them. Not everyone is fully conscious or consistent in holding to them. And this is the second edition. So there will be some changes from the first edition. It is written by Dr. Surrendra Gangadean. He taught philosophy in the classroom in Phoenix for 45 years. He was a pastor of a church for over 25, 30 years. He was a teacher in a seminary teaching theology for over 25 years. So he has seen a lot of questions in his day. He has faced a lot of questions. He has responded to all of them. I've never seen a question that Dr. Gangadean could not respond to. The book is published by Public Philosophy Press, which is my publishing company, but it's in conjunction with the Logos Foundation. There are a lot of people who helped make this book happen, and we want to thank those people because they worked hard. And we worked together, and it was great. It is dedicated to his children and those they represent, the future. It is dedicated to his children and their future and the future to come after. All right, then you look at the contents. What is inside this book? So the main sections are epistemology, how do I know? Metaphysics, what is real? Ethics, what is the good, or how ought I to live? And then there are some appendices, additions, things that are addressed that are kind of meta. They're about what's about in the book. Now, I wanted to read the preface with you. I'm just going to read and comment. This is what I would do in class. Maybe I'm talking more on video than I would in class, but you would expect that, right? So the preface, I'm going to read it because I'd like to give you the context that the author sets for us. He says, philosophy is needed by all. Okay, now you can pause and think about that. Is that true? Is philosophy needed by all? So this book is written for all. It is written for those who are beginning to think deeply about basic things and for those who have wandered in the labyrinth for a while. It is also written for those who have been avoiding the subject for any number of good or bad reasons. So think about that. It's written for newbies, people who are just in Philosophy 101, and it's written for people who've been thinking a long time but haven't found answers. And it's written for people who have been avoiding a lot of deep topics for good or bad reasons. So face those questions. What is investigated here are answers to the most basic questions we can ask. Can we know anything? What ultimately exists? What is real? What ought I to do? The reader may understandably ask, why another book on the subject? Is there anything new under the sun? If we can learn from the past, if we can learn from challenges and conflicts, if we can learn from our suffering, then we can become more conscious and consistent in what we think and do. This book is offered as another step in that direction. So already you can see that it's going to take seriously questions people have, and it's also going to take seriously that we suffer, and that suffering has a purpose. Because of the range of readers, not everything here is intended for all. All can follow the main line of argument, even when names and ideas are mentioned without being introduced. The more advanced reader doesn't need it, and the beginner is being spared a burden. So he's doing two things. He might drop a name like Hegel or Kant, but he's not really introducing them, because if you're a newbie, you don't need to know that right now. You can Google. If you're a seasoned philosophy student, you will already know the reference. There has been a continuing dilemma to include more and to exclude more. So how much to include, how much to exclude? That's where the history of philosophy companion volume is going to help us. It includes things not in this book about other philosophers. An outline, an introduction, footnotes, glossary, suggested readings, bibliography, and index are added to help. So notice he intends the parts of the book to help you as a reader. So make use of those things. This book will be read profitably if the reader continually proceeds from what is more basic to what is less basic. So there are points in the book where you're going to have to say, do I agree with that? And if I don't, I probably need to stop here and think about that, and think about why I don't agree with that, and not move on. Because if you move on to less basic things without agreeing on the more basic things, you are not going to find yourself agreeing with the book and enjoying it. Critical thinking is by nature presuppositional. Let me say that again. Critical thinking is by nature presuppositional. Without the more basic in place, what comes after cannot be understood. So remember, this book is about foundations. We're going to get to the most basic piece. And then what comes after is building. And what we're building is a philosophical system. What we're building is a world and life view. What we're building is culture and civilization. We can't do that if we don't lay a good foundation first. And presuppositional thinking is that we think of the less basic in light of the more basic. More basic first, foundation before house. Okay? He says, caveat lector, may the reader be aware. So he's telling you, be aware of where he's coming from, what he's assuming of the reader, okay? And he wrote that in November of 2007. Then we have the acknowledgments. I'll let you read the acknowledgments. I'll let you look at the outline of the book. It's a very nice outline. If you're wondering, where are we going? What's he going to cover? Everything is there in the outline. It's really a tool, really a good tool. I just went through a book with some students about how to read a difficult book, and it advises students to make an outline of the book. Well, here in this book, you don't have to. It's already provided for you. What you can do is take that outline, though, write it down on a piece of paper, and start adding your own notes to it to help you navigate your own journey through this book. Okay, the introduction. Let's see, how many pages do we have here? It's about 6 pages, 5 pages. So I'm just going to read and comment. And this is new. So he wrote this introduction after the book had been out for many years, and many people read it and discussed with him. Many people had questions. So take that into consideration. He is thinking of all those years the book had been out, and questions you might be having already may be answered here. Introduction begins. Philosophical foundation argues that some things are clear. The basic things are clear. The basic things about God and man and good and evil are clear to reason. This thesis concerning what is clear is affirmed over and against skepticism in Western philosophy and fideism in Western theology. Okay, so notice this is his argument that some things are clear, the basic things are clear, the basic things about God and man and good and evil are clear to reason. So he's giving you the conclusion to his book in the first sentence. And then he's saying, He is affirming that some things are clear over and against skepticism, which says nothing is clear to reason, and fideism, which says nothing is clear, but you have to believe anyway. So you already see he's got a very clear focus in mind. Now your job is to read it and see if he's proven each of these lines over and against skepticism and fideism. Ordinary skepticism is a natural response to fideism, when the latter makes claims about God while offering no proof. Philosophical skepticism is likewise a natural response to the many claims of proof that have failed. So, fideism says just believe. Skepticism says, why should I believe? There's no proof. And then skepticism sees that what has claimed to be proof has actually not proven what they claim to prove. So skepticism and fideism feed off of one another, but both are assuming we can't really know. Nothing is clear. Now, there are some footnotes here. I'm skipping the footnotes. You get to read the footnotes. I'm just going to read the main text. Fully consistent skepticism holds that no knowledge at all is possible. Taken strictly, this would imply that even basic conceptual distinctions, such as the distinctions between being and non-being, and true and false, are not clear. So skepticism pushed to its logical, consistently held position is going to say we can't know the difference between being and non-being, between true and false. But the denial of all meaningful distinctions is self-defeating and is a counsel of despair. Now, despair is hopelessness. Examined closely, however, this intellectual despair is seen to be rooted in uncritically held assumptions. So despair and hopelessness is not the only option. The other option is to go, I wonder if I have assumptions that are causing me to despair. They're uncritically held assumptions. One need not avoid skepticism by adopting the antinomy of fideism. So we don't have to go into despair. We don't have to go into fideism. We can go, wait a minute, maybe there are assumptions here that are blocking us from seeing what is clear. One can respond to the assumptions leading to skepticism by critically examining these assumptions or presuppositions for coherence of meaning. So what's great about this book is Dr. Gangadean is going to lay out those uncritically held assumptions and show us how we may be holding on to those and show how they're incoherent and how we can change our mind. 12 assumptions of skepticism will be examined and found wanting, as well as 12 assumptions of fideism, after which the question of how knowledge is possible will be considered. Isn't that nice? Here are 12 assumptions that you might be having that are causing skepticism, 12 assumptions that are possibly causing your fideism, how they come short, and how knowledge is possible. Wouldn't you want to read a book like that? I do. Generally speaking, knowledge claims have been based either on experience, which is called empiricism. All of our knowledge is through sense experience, or reason, which has been called rationalism. Generally speaking, knowledge claims have been based either on experience or on reason. Experience has been appealed to in many forms. Experience of others in the past, for example, tradition and testimony. Experience of all, as in common sense. Experience of one's own mental states, as in intuition. And theories which can be verified by experiment, such as science. Yet, the assumption present in interpreting any experience often goes unnoticed and is itself a form of fideism. So notice there are many ways people claim to know by experience. Testimony of others, tradition, common sense, intuition, science, but all of those have assumptions, and those assumptions come into interpreting the experiences that we have. Reason itself can become an occasion of skepticism when it is first used as a source of truth rather than as a test for meaning. For example, Descartes said, I think, therefore I am. Later, we'll see there are objections to that. Thomas Jefferson said, we hold these truths to be self-evident. In the Declaration, we'll see there have been questions about that. Reason can also be an occasion for skepticism when it is used constructively only to build a house, for coherence within a worldview, or in theoretical mathematics, or in positing logically possible worlds. All of those are using reason constructively, and they're not first using reason critically as a test for meaning of actual basic beliefs. So we're going to see that rationalism has the problem of making systems that are rationally coherent, but the foundation upon which that system rests is not coherent, violates the laws of thought. So the whole system crumbles, and then people say, see, we tried rationalism and reason failed us. Well, how about the use of reason? People using reason failed to use reason critically. It wasn't reason that failed. Okay, the attempt to mitigate skepticism by appeal to what works, which is called pragmatism, merely begs the question about value judgments and about rational justification for one's view of the good, which is your highest value. So some people say, well, I'm just going to do what works. And this fails to recognize that what works also has assumptions. This book argues that knowledge is possible by reason and argument applied presuppositionally, beginning with one's most basic belief. So we're going to start with basic beliefs, and we're going to go step by step to less basic beliefs, like ethics and how to apply ethics. This work also argues against fideism, which is either implicitly or explicitly present in the history of Christian thought. It's in other thought too. Fideism is not just a Christian epistemological error. Fideism can be an error for any person who is not willing to give proof for basic beliefs. Most human beings live by tradition. The beliefs of tradition, which are not based on sight, are based on an implicit trust in custom, what one is accustomed to. So tradition is built on the past without a critical examination of the past. Beliefs held by custom are not beliefs based on proof, unless you have a tradition of proof. I'd love to be part of that tradition. Beliefs not based on proof are commonly said to be a matter of one's faith. Fideism is a more conscious affirmation of faith, understood as belief not based on proof. Some people are really proud of this. I believe because I can't prove it. Fideism minimally maintains that proof for the existence of God is either not necessary or not possible or not relevant. So belief in God is a basic belief. Fideism says we cannot prove that basic belief. This book is going to argue to the contrary. Yet historic Christianity teaches that Christ died for our sins and that the inexcusability of unbelief is grounded in the clarity of general revelation. This is from the New Testament book of Romans, chapter 1, verse 20. So Christianity teaches that Christ died for everyone, and everyone is without excuse for their unbelief in God because it's clear that God exists, and it's clear from general revelation. So this book is part of general revelation, what all people everywhere could know, thinking about the nature of reality. Now, some people say, well, how can everyone be held accountable if not everybody knows Jesus? Well, this just told you how. It's not Jesus that you're held accountable for. It's the existence and nature of God, humans, good and evil. That's what we're held accountable for. If this is the case, then anyone affirming sin and inexcusability can reasonably be asked to show how God's eternal power and divine nature are clear from the things that are made. So if you're a believer in God, you should be able to show that it's clear that God exists, especially if you think this is a religion that is for everyone. Then everyone should be able to recognize their need for redemption in not seeing what is clear, in denying what is clear. Further, repentance of this root sin of not seeing what is clear and not understanding would seem to require all believers to seek to understand what is clear about God. So it's one thing to repent of not seeing, not seeking, not understanding, not doing what is right. But once you recognize that, you also need to start seeking to know and start seeking to show. And that's the value of this book. It's like a blueprint for showing how it's clear that God exists. While there has been occasional acknowledgement by some believers of the clarity of general revelation, the proofs offered historically have been less than adequate to show that there is something higher than the mind, or that there is a first cause of motion. Augustine and Aquinas tried to do that, is not to show God the creator. You need more to show God the creator. The teleological argument by itself shows only a designer. As we go through the book, you'll see there are different proofs for the existence of God: the ontological argument, the cosmological argument, the teleological argument from design, and the teleological moral argument. He's going to go through each of those and show how classically each has come short, but together with a reformulation, we can get to the clarity of God's existence. The ontological argument, Anselm, by itself shows at best that there must be something eternal, not that only some God is eternal. A recent form of the transcendental argument argues from the triune God of the scriptures rather than from general revelation. This is called the tag argument. It's kind of popular right now. It fails to see that reason is both transcendental, self-attesting as the laws of thought, and ontological, which means reason applies to being as well as to thought. This includes God's being. God's being is not both eternal and non-eternal at the same time and in the same respect, which means reason is not a created aspect of the world. It is an uncreated aspect of the nature of God. So reason, and anytime there's a being, there's reason applied to being. So God is a being, reason applies to the being of God. He can't both be eternal and non-eternal in the same respect and at the same time. This will be explained as we go through the book. There is need then for the philosopher and the theologian to begin their work on the necessary assumption that some things are clear. That has to be where we start. And going through the history of philosophy, Dr. Gangadean goes through each philosopher and shows that that's where they didn't start, and that's why we have a history of unresolved disputes. Since thinking by nature is presuppositional, we think of the less basic in light of the more basic. If anything is clear, then basic things must be clear. Failure to critically analyze our most basic assumption for meaning has been the recurrent source of both skepticism and fideism. Nothing is clear. In part one of this work, I analyze the presuppositional nature of philosophy and reason, and identify several sources of skepticism and fideism. I conclude by arguing that we can have knowledge by reason and argument, and show how we can know there must be something eternal. Isn't that great? He's making a big promise right here. Your job is to test it out to see if he follows through. In part two, I offer a sequence of arguments to show that only some is eternal. Matter exists, and matter is not eternal. He gives arguments for that. Wouldn't you like an argument that matter exists? I call it the $50 argument. Matter is not eternal, meaning matter had to start somewhere. The soul exists. Wouldn't you like an argument that the soul exists? Do you have one? And the soul is not eternal. It's not forever. But we want arguments, right? So you got to keep reading. I address the principle of counter-arguments to God as creator in the problem of origin and the problem of evil. What about evolution? Doesn't evolution say something about, human evolution and human nature and the existence of God? Well, he does address it. And the problem of evil. Now, the problem of evil is the number one counter-argument to belief in God. If God is all good and if God is all good and all powerful, why is there evil? So he's going to take that challenge head on. And I promise you're going to like his solution. It's very unique. It's original. By combining revised forms of the ontological, cosmological, and teleological arguments, the eternal power and divine nature of God can be clearly seen. In part three, by distinguishing virtue, happiness, and the good, long-standing ethical disputes are clarified. Rational justification for the good, the end in itself, man's chief end, is provided, which then becomes the basis of deriving the moral law from human nature. As a result, it can be shown that there is a moral law which is clear, comprehensive, and critical. So the moral law is rooted in human nature. He's going to derive each law. There are 10 of them. They're based on universal moral principles that are rooted in human nature. So it doesn't come from the outside. It doesn't come from above. It comes from here. And it's clear, it's comprehensive, meaning it covers all aspects of human life, human choice, human activity, and it is critical, a matter of life and death. So this is the part about meaning that you're looking for. Philosophy is concerned with foundational matters. Remember the foundation. It deals with the most basic questions we can ask. Is knowledge possible? What is real or eternal? Ought I to know? What ought I to know? What ought I to do? In principle, only philosophy asks these questions and seeks proof for the answers to these questions. So in principle, this is the job of philosophy, to ask these questions and find answers. And philosophers have been doing it for thousands of years. They've been struggling. They've been trying. We find ourselves in a day that is highly skeptical. And I think Dr. Gangadean has taken into consideration that history, has wrestled with it himself, and has brought the logical options before us for us to consider. However lacking it has been in achieving consensus in its answers, there is agreement that these are the fundamental questions in the history of philosophy. This work accepts the task of philosophy in principle and seeks a fuller, more consistent application of critical thinking to this task. So Dr. Gangadean has looked at the history of philosophy for pretty much his whole life. He died at 78. So that's a lot of years spent devoted to wrestling with the problems of philosophy and, I think, overcoming the challenges up to our day, including our day. The really neat part about the History of Philosophy book is that I found a 10-page handwritten meditation on critical theory, and it was not intended for that book in 1997 and 1998 because we were hardly thinking about critical theory back then. But I included it in the history of philosophy because it fit so perfectly and it was so relevant. And so he has taken into consideration the entire history of philosophy, the challenges that have been with us for thousands of years, and he addresses them. And I want you to see it one by one by one. And I want this book to become relevant to life. It's not just a philosophy book, but it is a book that is written for people who have deep-seated philosophical questions. And maybe you didn't even know you had philosophical questions. Maybe you're just watching this video because your friend asked you to watch it. We'll pause now. The next section is part 1, epistemology. How do we know? So we'll talk about clarity, philosophy, and reason next. And I can't guarantee that these videos are going to be short. Maybe I have to cut them in half. I don't know, but I might just go with it because I've been trying to keep things to 20 minutes, but that's not going to work. So thank you for joining me. I hope that you will love this book as much as I do. And again, Philosophical Foundation, a critical analysis of basic beliefs. You can get it on Amazon. Get it. Join me and let's keep the conversation going. You can drop a comment below. The comments are moderated, but I check them every day. So don't forget to like, subscribe, share, invite your friends. Let's have a revival of philosophy in our day. Okay, let's get the foundation in place. Thanks for joining me. I'll see you in the next video.